to pre-film an effect like this, you can give it a go.
So what do? You get a whale, you get it in a swimming pool, like you paint the back green, like
and there probably is some way that you could do something, right?
Hello, welcome back to the next episode of Behind the Curtain, and this is where we delve further into Avatar. So in our first video on Avatar, we did a very much an overview. And on this one, we're going to start looking at specific details of what is an absolute gigantic piece of art, really. The focus of this video is going to be water. And Chris, why are we looking at water? Is it something that's close to our hearts?
Yeah, well, I'm just amazed with how much they've done of the water, because fluids are really difficult to do and really expensive to do in visual effects on this kind of scale.
Yeah.
So we recently delivered a series for Netflix called Half Bad, where we exploded a few people in slow motion. And, you know, people have got a decent amount of fluid in them. And it took us...
turns out, yeah.
It turns out, yeah.
But it's flying all over the screen, yeah.
Doing that show. And so then we obviously did a lot of fluids in that, you know, is the people's blood was slowly getting expanded across the room, and that took us months and months and months, you know, all in probably the best part of a year, and that's a team of people doing it. So when you expand that across something like Avatar, which I believe is 12 hours long, and I can't remember, but it's it's a long ass film with a lot of water in it. Then the considerations and the fact that what they've achieved is mind-boggling, you know, from a visual point of view.
Absolutely. And the reason that we're focusing on water is just it's a question of scale. Like what we want to try and get across to you guys is that these films are works of art on almost a magnitude that you don't see anywhere else. Like I don't know how many people Weta had working on Avatar at any one point. It could easily be 400. That 400 artists. That could be, you know, it could be probably smaller during earlier production stages, whatever. It may well have ramped up to be more than that at peak times. Some of the largest companies in the UK or the world will have 1,000 artists that were working across a few shows. So 400 is not an unreasonable number to pick out. And they would have been working for years on this. So probably 2 at least. Like, I don't know the exact production times for Avatar, but the amount of effort and work that goes, you just do not do this quickly. So what else in the world could you think of that has 400 artists working for 2 years? Like, you know, Sistine Chapel, one person, fairly talented bloke, like 4 years. You're sort of talking the order of magnitude of the pyramids. You know, it's an absolute colossal achievement. So when we come to breaking it down, Chris and I were like, well, how do you talk about this in detail? And you just do have to drill down into just one tiny aspect. So that's why we've chosen the water, the fluid aspect of Avatar for this video, because there's so much involved just in that one aspect. So are there any particular shots that you wanted to focus on, Chris?
Well, let's see. Let's look for something outside of the water to start with, where we've got splashes and things. And you know, one thing that we need to consider when we consider water is kind of, well, how do you make it? And water is an effect. And obviously in visual effects, everything is an effect, but a subset of visual effects is what we call effects. And effects is water, fire, smoke, you know, explosions, all of those kind of things. And when it comes to doing effects, so here we go. This might be a nice one to talk about, is you basically have 2 approaches. One is using what we call elements, which is where you actually film footage that might be on a black screen or a green screen, basically giving you some way of separating out that footage. So you might do that with fire or blood or whatever. You actually create the effect in real life, you film it, and then you composite it in, you layer it over the top. That's a very, very, very common way of doing effects. Avatar will have had a whole bunch of that, absolutely no doubt. It's very very rare that you would find anyone doing effects that doesn't involve some element of that. And it's also the cheapest way of doing effects. The most expensive way is what probably 90% of the effects in Avatar are, and that is actual 3D simulation. And like we were speaking about before, and we speak about all the time, what you're doing in visual effects is you are creating the most primitive representation of reality that you can get away with. And when it comes to fluid simulation, you're actually creating a pretty good representation of reality. So what you're seeing on screen right now will actually be this was made of what we call polygons, just like little bits of water splashing up, or ultimately would become polygons. It takes a journey through particles, whatever. I'm not going to get into that. Ultimately, will be something that has some solidity to it, and it has a material applied to it that has the refractive index of water. The refractive index being how much light bends as it goes through a thing. So water, it's 1.33, I think.
So it has some elements of sort of physical simulation of reality. So that sort of attempt to mimic it, but it's impossibly complex. So everything that we're dealing with is an approximation. You know, even the algorithms that are written by the people that develop the fluid software, they are making their best approximation and then optimizing that process as much as possible so a computer could physically get through it. Like, you know, because it's such a complex thing.
Well, and then as soon as you start getting close to reality, you then hit this issue of, but what if reality isn't what you want, right? So, you know, so maybe you're looking at reference of a whale breaching water and you're going, this is the amount of splash that I would expect an animal of this size to make. And the director goes, great, that's what a whale does. For this shot, we needed much more, or we needed much less, or whatever it is. Well, suddenly physical reality is not your friend anymore, because what you want is not reality, but an art directed thing, a thing that is going to help you tell the story of the film, because films are not reality. Of course, they are a specific lens into reality, and therefore a distortion of it. So then what you need to be able to do is not only make something that feels real and follows laws of physics, but you also need the freedom to be able to change that not only to however you want, but however your client wants, which could be any amount of things. So then you have the problem of okay, how do you control it? And here, like, if we're talking about water simulation, are you then trying to simulate the ocean, right? That's a very, very complex thing with a whole bunch of stuff going on in it. So what you'll generally tend to do is to break it down into into digestible chunks, let's say.
Little jigsaw pieces.
So you know, the actual surface of the water is probably going to be one thing, and you know, and certainly back here, I doubt that's simulated. Maybe may not be, but you don't need simulation for that, you know, because there's unless you know there were waves coming up here or anything that looks.
And at that point, you know, so this is a really good. So you started off by introducing water as something, an effect that, you know, effects, sometimes you film them and then you comp them in. I think an effect at that distance, say you had splashing up against that little island, that's something where you could get perhaps like an element, a piece of footage that had been shot on a background, and then you could just offer it up in a compositing package, like as a piece of footage, get it integrated quite nicely, and that would be brilliant. But for the actual whale breaching the water, for example, like for all the reasons you've talked about, the art direction and things like that, that's going to be harder to apply that there.
Yes, yeah. To pre-film an effect like this, you can give it a go, right?
I'm chuckling where this conversation is going. So what do? You get a whale, you get it in a swimming pool, like, you paint the back green, like, you know.
And there probably is some way that you could do something, right? You'd have to do it to scale. You'd have to take like something of this sort of shape, of a whaley sort of shape, and you'd have to make sure that your lighting is consistent, you know, because obviously, like this whale, for example, is not. Where is the light source here? It's pretty difficult to read without. Here we go. There's some shadows.
Probably.
So, light source is
top right. Yeah. That's sort of.
Do you think the angle's more extreme than that? I don't know. But it's behind this whale, right? So we're getting the kind of the form shadow of the whale through here, and then this is getting backlit by the light that is behind it. So if you were filming that to then composite that in, you would have to, you know, try and make sure that you're matching that lighting. And then, of course, if you're not matching to scale, if you're not actually using a whale-sized object, then your water droplets are going to end up feeling out of scale
too
and
big or too small. So,
and incidentally, so sorry, Rich, but that is an area where miniatures fall down. I love it when miniatures are used. I'm a huge fan of them, and I kind of do wish they used more because there is some tactile magic to them. But when it comes to effects, that's where they'll often fall down because
like a miniature is in a biginiature is in a physical actual representation of So water,
you're making a set, but you're making it much smaller and then damaging it. But the thing is, water reacts differently according to scale, of course. So you have something that's 1 meter big and it's supposed to represent something that's 100 meters big. It's going to look kind of weird when you're running water through a 1 meter thing. If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So like, and the other thing about art direction, like say you go out and you find this whale that's breaching the water, you train the whale, so the whale is now breaching the water at exactly the point that you wanted it to breach. So you filmed it and your son was on the left, and then the client turns around and goes, actually for this shot we want everything to be lit from the right. Well, your footage is lit from the left. You can't flip it because now the splash is going in the wrong direction. You don't have the flexibility to when you're working with those sort of live plates, to integrate them. You don't always have the flexibility you need to make a convincing effect like this. Yeah. So live plates, filming them, getting that sort of library of stuff, super useful, often for stuff that's slightly further away or more controllable. Something like this, we're talking full simulation, and therefore we can have the correct scales, but within the 3D software now. I imagine you sort of have to build everything to scale and do it that way.
Yeah, that's actually a key part of simulation, and I'm embarrassed to say we've been caught out several times by that. If whoever is making the model doesn't make it according to a real world scale, because of course, if you think about you're building something in digital software, the software itself, that whole digital world, it can be any size you want. So it's very common that that a modeler, for example, who's making something might make something and not think about the scale, because there's no tangible way to know that. If you're making something in real life, you know how big or small it is, but when you're doing it digitally, the only way to know is to actually measure it. And so it's not uncommon that, especially a junior artist will make something that's supposed to be 100 meters high, but they accidentally make it, to be 2 centimeters high.
And then you pass it to a simulation, and that simulation software is dealing with things like gravity is 9.81 meters per second, and that's a very precise value for a very particular size in your scene. And if your object is the wrong size, then things start not to feel like they're the right scale. In fact, you could end up with a miniature type situation, can't you? Where it's like, why is the water not like behaving like water? Like, but yeah.
So Rich, this kind of takes us back really to this same idea of like when you're working in visual effects, or especially when you're working in 3D aspects of visual effects, just try and make things like they should be.
Yeah.
It sounds like such an obvious thing, but it's not an obvious thing, because you open up Blender, let's say, and it's like, it's just so much to even learn it and to get the ball rolling or whatever. You can very quickly just lose track of the fact that actually you need to be trying to mimic reality. And this feeds through into all areas. So, in lighting, for example, when I'm supervising someone lighting a shot, I'll just be like, try and light it like it was on set, maybe, here, if this was on set, there would probably be no artificial lighting, right? You would just rely on the sunlight because it's such a huge area. So then you would try and recreate that. But when it's a more closed in set, then you might have multiple light sources. You might have people holding bounce boards or whatever to bounce the light around. Try and make it like it was on set, because then you're reducing the chances of you deviating in a randomly wrong direction. So making things as they should be in reality is really a core, is a keystone of visual effects. And then you deviate from that so that you can art direct it and whatever.
And in this case, the important thing is to start with as close to reality as possible, so how big is this whale? Like, so you gotta find out from whoever's in the design process, is this a killer whale? Is it a blue whale? Is it, and then you can start making the scene and the area that you're going to simulate over, the collision geometry, whatever you're going to be building for that simulation is going to be as close to as if a whale broke the surface of the water, and that's your starting point. Like, Otherwise, you can really fight against that. If you build things the wrong scale, and then the simulation doesn't quite isn't looking right, you start changing all the settings to try and make the simulation look right. And actually, the problem was just your scale was wrong at the very, very beginning. So don't fight the scale. Get the scale right at the beginning. That's a tick. Now we don't have to worry about it. And now tweak your settings. Like,
Rich, I want to take a minute just to kind of go, because what we're going to be talking about here is 3D simulation, and we've kind of gone, okay, you have two ways of doing effects, right? You can do it as elements, where so you can check out, for example, actionvisualeffects.com. That would be one place that you can go see the kind of elements people buy and use, or you can do simulation. And what we're kind of saying here is, if you wanted to hit stuff like this, the only viable option is with simulation.
Yeah.
But there may be elements even used here in shot. I doubt it, but it could be that, the director is looking at the shot and going, I feel like I'm ready to sign this shot off, but we can just see too much of the whale underneath, and that bothers me because it makes the water feel like it's not, like there's not enough of it. So there could be a world where you go like, okay, fine, we can't go back to simulation because, for reasons that I'm going to get to in a minute, simulation is time-consuming and expensive. So I'm just going to find some element of spraying water, and I'm going to overlay that. And going back to the effects we did for Half-Bad, 90-something% of those effects are 3D simulated effects. But at the end of the day, there were some places where we just went, you know what, a little bit more blood there, and then we're just going to use pre-film, so essentially stock footage, really, but pre-film footage of blood under certain conditions, and we're going to lay that over the top.
So that's a really important distinction between the pre-film stock footage elements that come out and then the sort of the 3D simulated stuff. I'm just going to throw one spanner in the works and confuse things a tiny little bit, because what you can do is, when you have an accurate 3D simulation, is you can produce your own elements from that simulation. Like, so if you have a situation where everything is looking really cool here, the lighting is coming from the right direction, everything is the right size, what you can do is you can use the ability to randomize software. You can change often what is called the seed of randomization within software to create multiple versions of a situation, render off those individual versions, and then a comp artist can say, oh, I actually like version 37 there, like I'm going to borrow a bit of that and put that in. And Chris and I have done that for each other hundreds of times, where we did melted plastic once, Chris. I don't know if you remember, but we were trying to do a robot with loads of melted parts across the robot for a Netflix series. And in the end, I was like, well, why don't I just generate 200 different pieces of random, like proceduralized melted robot, and you can pick out the ones that you want. And that worked really well when we were sort of putting the whole thing together. So there'll definitely be elements of that in here as well.
Yes. Right? Yeah, for sure. And again, if you go to if you just search for using elements for compositing, like I say, action visual effects is just one example. You will often find that there will be pre-made 3D effects there. So it's not just filmed things; it's 3D generated things as well. And what you could do is, for example, here, if you were running this through as lots of little simulations, then you could have a simulation for a bit here, a simulation for a bit here, certainly a simulation for like generic splashes and whatever. And then because that's 3D, if you want to, you can then duplicate that and move it around and use it to fill out other places. So there is definitely some wiggle room here when it comes to what's 3D and what's effects. And what's elements. And what I would say is there's no hard and fast rule. When you're figuring out shots, you'll start to figure out whether it should be 3D or whether it should be an element. You might start out trying to do it with pre-filmed elements just so you can get something quickly. Normally you'll just get a feeling for it. So for example, blood hits, it's very common that's going to be an element, right? Because it's just going to be a very quick thing. It's limited. Elements are always limited. So if you have a blood hit, right, someone's just bang been hit by a bullet and you get a blood spray, 90% of the time that's done as an element, but what it does mean is any blood that's sprayed up is not then going to fall back down on the character, because that would require simulation. So, but simulation is going to take you a little while longer, and there's going to be extra complications with that. So your trade-off is basically in terms of the amount of work. And when you're going into 3D simulation, the amount of work opens up massively. I mean, obviously you need to have these creatures animated so that there is something to simulate with. So, you know, you've got that expense. But then even as you're doing the simulation, the problem that you have is the amount of time that it takes to compute it, which is often a huge amount of time. So then, you know, you've got your animation, right, of the whale creature breaching the water, and then you run a simulation of that through, and it gives you certain results, right? Maybe the splash is only coming up to here, but you know that the director wants the splash to come really high. So then you've got to figure out what you would change about the settings to make that go really high, or is there any way that you could fake it, or whatever it's going to be. And that might take you might need to leave a computer running overnight and before you get your next pass on it. So it's actually part of the reasons why 3D effects are so expensive is because there is a huge amount of computing time necessary for that.
Alongside the artist time,
alongside the artist time. So again, referencing the half-bad example, one of the key problems that I had there, because you know I wasn't doing the effects myself, it's done by Eddie Woodall, one of our effects guys, and who actually did 90% of that exploding, the actual effects work himself, like really incredible work. But the problem we would have is the client would say, we want to see something in 4 days. But to actually simulate the effects might take 2 days. And it's very difficult to know until you get to the end of the simulation whether or not it's going to work. So then you basically have to sit tight for 2 days and hope that it's gonna look okay. And if it doesn't, then suddenly you've only got 2 more days before you have to show something to the client. So you better hope that whatever changes you make for the next time you simulate it are going to work. And
the industry has really moved forward in that area, because now you can actually set up your simulations and send them out across a network so that other computers can actually start simulating those things for you. There are entire like setups and systems in software like Houdini where you can say, look, I want to run this simulation, but I want to run it 5 times with 5 different variations. So then when you get to the end of that, you have those different examples and you can go, okay, my guess was this one was going to work best, but actually I really like this variation. More importantly, let's show them to the client and the client can pick which one they want, like, if that makes sense. So there's ways now that you know, if you're going to do effects work in a complex way, it's no longer one person sitting at a desk with their computer, because that's now incredibly inefficient. Good companies are supported by network simulating processing, network caching, or at the very least have 2 desktops next to you, and you can work on one while the other one simulates, and then switch over as needed, if you get what I mean. But that balance between artistic time and then the added complexity of computing the thousands of calculations that have to go on to actually run these simulations, it does make this a difficult field, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, and like Rich, with what you're saying, like, you know, because let's say that you send this simulation out across, you know, 10 different computers with different settings, you know, so then you kind of go like, okay, it's hopefully going to be one of those simulations. But what you can have is a chain of dependencies where one simulation is dependent on another. And so that's something that you can't actually distribute across computers. So coming back to Steve, our security guard, ripping in half-bad, there are, I don't know how many different simulations happening there, you know? It starts with his skin ripping, and then underneath his skin, there's going to be his layer of subcutaneous fat that jiggles and wobbles as his skin rips. And underneath that, you have at least 4 different systems calculating blood in different ways. And in conjunction with that, you have veins and tendons and whatever that are also getting stretched out and ripping. And what you end up with is a chain of dependencies. So, for example, you can't simulate the fat until you simulated the skin, because the fat is conjoined to the skin. So you can't actually spread that out across multiple computers. You have to wait for one to finish for the next one to start. And And yeah, that especially for exploding a human body, which hopefully we'll only have to do once. But it's not going back for series 2. Good though it is, 93% Rotten Tomatoes. But yeah, there are a lot of things in a human body, and there's a lot of codependency.
What we ended up actually doing for it is having a system that chained the simulations one after the other, because the trouble with what Chris is talking is that you can end up with an artist having to get up multiple times in the night. Like it's like having a little baby that needs to be fed all the time. Like, you know, like it does the first simulation, now the first simulation's finished, well, now we can start the second simulation, but if no one's there to do it, you know, then it's not going to start, so someone has to wake up and start it. Yeah. And actually, back in the day, Chris and I used to set our alarms through the night, you know, just to start the next render or start the next caching thing. Yeah. But these days, fortunately, in software like Houdini, you can actually have like sort of TOPS networks and things they're called, which is quite too technical for the call, but like it effectively allows you to detect when one simulation has finished, take the data from that, feed it into the next simulation. So if you had something like the whale, like in the shot that I'm going to call it a whale jumping out of the water. I'm sure it absolutely isn't a whale. I am going to see Avatar. I'm really excited about it. I haven't found 3 hours or whatever it is to get down there yet. But like it may well be that one simulation is the water that is spraying off the animal's back, and then you might have a fine mist spray that comes off the water. That's quite common for you to have, sort of like one movement of water and then like a fine particle mist that comes off that. Well, the particles don't know where to emit from until that first initial water spray has finished the simulation. So that would be an example of that sort of dependency of having to plan things to cue those things one after the other. So so we're on like 26 minutes there. Like we've talked a lot about how we physically can simulate the movement of water. Chris, is there anything you want to talk about the rendering of water? Like, because there's so many different aspects to water. There's like the
yeah. Well, okay. So here's an interesting
and
thing.
What do we mean by rendering? Like, you know.
Yeah. So rendering is essentially digital filming, right? It's what creates your final image. So you know you'll have your modeling process of actually creating the creatures or whatever that then need to be painted, and they need to be rigged, which is with a puppet inside them. So that then they can be animated, and then when they're animated, everything needs to be lit, and then when it's lit, it can be rendered. And there's probably like 3 steps that I'm skipping there, but that's that's basically the process of getting an image out of 3D software. And like we've said before, rendering, most modern renderers these days are trying to get as physically realistic as they can. So then it's keeping in with this theme of like, okay, just try and make things realistic. So what you'd have with these water effects, for example, is you would just put a shader on them, a shader being the thing that gives them their material that is going to
which is how they
replicate
react to light.
Replicate the material properties of water so that it reacts to light accordingly. So with water, it's pretty much transparent. But the important thing is the refractive index, how much the light bends as it goes through it. So that would be your consideration when you're outside of the water. There's an interesting thing though for the underwater shots where you're actually not doing water simulation here at all, even though you're surrounded by water. This is a weird thing, but in the 3D software, there is essentially not going to be any water here at all. It's just not necessary because you don't have any visible splashes or waves or ripples or anything like that. It needs to be simulated. So when you're underneath the water, your consideration of how to represent water changes massively. And one of the key ways that you need to sell it is through essentially the atmospheric perspective, which is how the colors change the further away from the camera that you get. Which you see all the time. You see outside, right? If you're looking at anything in the distance, because what's happening is, even if you look at your own hand in front of your face, you're seeing a small percentage of atmosphere and a very large percentage of hand. The further that object gets away from you, you're seeing more atmosphere, a higher percentage of atmosphere, a higher ratio of atmosphere, and a lower ratio of the object. So
there's more atmosphere in between your point of your eyes, your point of view, and the thing you're looking at. And I guess these big underwater scenes, there's these huge volumes of water in front of the camera, and that has an effect.
So right. So the further away you go from camera, the more water you are seeing, and the less of whatever object may be there that you're seeing. So what happens is the objects become less detailed. So, if we look at the stuff in the background here, that is, I guess, the same structure as that, right? But there's much less contrast and it's much more blue. I believe that water is blue. That's a confusing thing, like what is the color of water? Is it transparent, whatever? I think that actually water is slightly blue, and that's why even when you're quite deep under the water, as long as there's still light getting in there, it has a blue tinge to it. So
also, when you look up and there's anything involving the sky, then a big blue sky above the water surface will be raining blue light down as well. So it will be blue light entering the camera. So you're going to be having that blue hue that way as well. But
and the atmospheric perspective underneath the water, it's actually following the same rules as it does outside, because I mean the sky is blue for another phenomenon called radial scattering. We'll get into another time. It's important, but for now the sky is blue, right? So the further away you see a thing, the more of the sky that you're seeing and the less of the object that you're seeing, which is the exact same phenomenon as you're having here. It's just under the water, what you're seeing is water rather than sky.
But what's interesting with a computer is that by default, computers, when they simulate environments, they're too perfect. So they won't do this. Like everything in the distance will have exactly the same contrast, detail, like, highlight, shadow. If you don't put this in, if you don't put this sense of atmosphere in, or this sense of depth into the scene, the computer won't add it for you. So, it's one of these things that we have to think about, because without it, things will not feel like they have scale. They have, this, if you want a huge expansive feel to something and you miss this detail, trust me, it will feel tiny. Like, you really, really need to have it in order to appreciate the scale of something. I think there's a shot later on with a whale underwater. Like, I'm going to keep calling them whales. They've got multiple eyes and clearly are not whales. but it again, sort of like the close point. I don't know where it is, but
I think I know what you mean. I think it might be much earlier on here.
There we go. So this guy here, look at the shadows in the foreground are darker. The details are crisper, more contrasty, and that gives you this feeling that the fin of the whale is very close to the camera. But by the time you get to
that,
exactly, like look at the brightness of the highlight, look at the darkness of the shadow, look at the the rate of the speed of that change in detail, and we lose all of that towards the top because there's such an expanse of water in between, and that's what gives us scale. But we have to fake it. It won't do it for us.
And this is where just basic understandings of how light work and how materials work will take you through a long way. I mean, I'm a big fan in visual effects of just going, the technology is important, but let's understand how the real world works first. How materials work, how cameras work, all of that stuff. And that's really going to help level up your visual effects. I mean, to take a slight tangent here, but it's something that it's just a very powerful concept for you to use, is what we call black levels. It's just like looking at what color is black in a shot. And the reason why I think it's such a powerful concept is because the color that you think a thing is in the shot may not be the actual color that it is. And black is a really useful reference point. So, I don't know what is black here. This is pretty dark. This is pretty dark as well. Those are, potentially what we would refer to as an actual black object. But if you were to color pick this in Photoshop, that's my eyedropper tool, then you would find out that actually you would see that this actually is is nowhere near black. Neither is that. And the further away that you get, so potentially these are black points up here, the further away that you get from the camera, the less black it is, because what you're seeing is more ocean. And so even if the point of visual effects you're at is that you can open up one thing and you can put another thing over on top. That's an amazing point to reach. I think that's an ideal point to reach as you're starting out. Can you put one thing over the top of another? And if you can, then great. And then your question is, well, how do you get those things to match? And being able to see the differences of those that's a very, very powerful skill. And one thing that we'll do is we will look for commonalities, and black is a very useful commonality. So what does black look like in this thing that I filmed on this day, and what does black look like in this other thing that I'm trying to put on top to make it feel like it's the same world? If the blacks match, and other things, if the whites match and the reds match and whatever, ultimately, once you start to crank those things in, then you're going to get two things that feel like they sit really close together. So it's a very powerful concept.
And that also, when you see people film, you'll see them hold all sorts of grey balls, Macbeth charts, which are like coloured squares and things. They'll hold them up to the camera, and that's just to give us that sort of information about when you're filming in different environments. What does a true red look like? What does a black look like? What does this look like? And that allows you to match different shots if you're then going to integrate them together, which is I mean, which is slightly different to this because we're not integrating footage, we're rendering it all, but like, it's such an important detail to be aware of and to observe. Like, it's weird that your annotation lands straight on that character. You know what? No, it's not weird, because those are two consecutive shots that are edited together. They may well be edited together. That might have been an artistic decision, actually, like either by director DOP or just by the editor in this case, that the artist's eye or the audience's eye is in that area, and therefore maintain a point of interest in that area. So I'm going to go back on it and say that's
no, you're absolutely right. That's we stumbled across that, but that's definitely a thing. So so if we come back here, you can see obviously the scales are different, but the position is very, very close in shot. And this is now moving away from visual effects towards editing. But you will notice that if he was even like over here, that cut is not going to work anywhere near as well. So when you have the exact same thing in sequential shots, if they don't line up, it's going to create a jarring kind of effect. And maybe that's what you want.
Quite often used in horror, for example, like to introduce something unexpectedly in the frame. But normally you don't want the eye jumping around all over from shot to shot. It gets tiring. So
often you'll match to eye lines, right? You go, okay, where is the guy's eye in this shot? And then you literally match that horizontal level in the next shot. Because it's very likely the audience is going to be looking at their eyes as well, and so that smooths the cutout. That, I think, was a really interesting cartridge. But since we've now deviated from visual effects entirely,
and from water,
and from Avatar, what are you having for dinner tonight?
Just to round it off. No, I think it's a good place to stop. Like, a little random nugget of information in the end there. But we hope you enjoy these. Like, we certainly enjoy recording them. We are going to drill down into particular topics to try and sort of bring out more explicit detail. If you want us to go into more technical detail, we are limiting our technical language here. We're more than happy to do that. Do give us some feedback. If you do like it, make sure you subscribe, and please join us for the next one, which we are not quite sure what we're going to be doing yet. It might be another one, Avatar. There's Megan, which is another film that's coming out, which could be very interesting. But whatever it is, we look forward to seeing you there. All the best. Take care. Goodbye.